Hello and welcome to JavaScript Marathon Training presented by this.labs. My name is Sarah Renaud with this.labs and I will be your host. We're kicking today off with our very exciting session of React Hooks 201. Today's trainer is Kyle Hill, Senior Software Engineer. Welcome, Kyle.
Hello.
You can find Kyle on Twitter using the handle shown at the bottom of the screen. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions or feedback. JavaScript Marathon would not be possible without our sponsors. Our sponsor today is this.labs, your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. Find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Do you find keeping up with constantly evolving technologies a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies? This.labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. Contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. We have a lot of really great events coming up, so check out our global meetups in Angular, GraphQL, React, and Vue. We also have a modern web meetup online. More details are available at this.co. And finally, JavaScript Marathon will be returning on Wednesday, December 5th. Stay tuned for more details. And with that, I'm going to hand it on over to Kyle.
Cool. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for getting up early for the first session of the day. Thanks to this.dot for putting this together and kind of giving the opportunity for me to talk about stuff. So I haven't really had a great past 2 weeks. This is actually true. I was scootering over to my friend's house on one of those kind of like rental electric scooters. If they have them in your city, you know what I'm talking about. They're usually ubiquitous. And I mistakenly pulled my phone out of my pocket to answer a phone call as I was going over a speed bump and kind of attacked it at an angle. Kind of tried to stick the landing rather than just sort of like put my feet on the ground, and ended up breaking 2 ribs. So I want to spread the good word of scooter safety tips to as many people as possible because, ow, just cautionary tale. I'm a literal walking cautionary tale. So what I want to do is sort of, build out a bunch of tools using kind of advanced level React hooks to sort of explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, and just with the lens of building a safety tips site. So this class is called React Hooks 201, and it is focused on people who have knowledge of what React useState is doing, and some knowledge of what React useEffect is doing, and kind of want to grow a little further from there. So this is positing that you're comfortable with the concept of using like useState. You understand what's happening behind the scenes, is that the the value being passed to the initial call of useState is the initial value. It returns both the value, the current value, and a setter inside of a array that you usually destructure. And then you can kind of go from there and use that value. Whenever something changes, the application will, like the render function for that component will refire. So we're positing that you're comfortable with all of that concepts, and let's figure out what other hooks are available built into React that allow us to go from just having a component know some things about itself to having a component be able to be connected by itself to a global state. And that's really what people really like, patterns like Redux and MobX and just the general Flux pattern is really having a global state where there's a specific place that is the central repository for all actions, the central repository for all knowledge. So what ends up being the case is that people will commonly use libraries like Redux or MobX or whatever to sort of have to create that pattern. Now, there's a lot of different choices about which of those architectural patterns to use, but they more or less work the same way. But with React hooks, we're able to create a global store that will allow all of our components to dispatch information to and receive information from that global store in a kind of Redux pattern without having to pull in any other libraries, and with a much more simple kind of structure to the application. So let's start building this from scratch. Right now, we've just got a very basic, minimally adapted Create React app setup where we've got some static content, a CSS file, and an index.js where all we're doing is rendering the application. So this is pretty straightforward. I removed a little bit of the cruft, but other than that, I did npx create React app like 15 minutes ago. So it's pretty straightforward. So the first thing we're going to want to do is set up a reducer function. If you've ever done Redux, this is going to be very, very common for you. So we're going to put this in a folder called contexts, and we're going to create a function called reducer.js. This is going to be a file where we're going to create a reducer function, which takes in a state and an action. So this pattern should be already very familiar, and export the reducer function. Let's just export this here and I'll have a default. And we'll also export a initial state, which will be taking in some information, which we actually don't really even care about, and we'll return an initial state. So if you're not familiar with the general reducer function pattern, the way it works is that there is an object that represents the state of an entire application. This is, all of the UI features, all of the things that any of the components know about themselves, or know about what's happened, or know about what data has been fetched. Everything that the application knows about itself goes into a single object. So there's lots of different keys which have, different values corresponding to what is pertinent. So you can have really complicated objects in here, but in reality, a single object is able to represent the entire flow of your application. So this reducer function takes in the current state as the first parameter, and then the second parameter is usually called action, and that is another object which, by convention, has a key called type in it that kind of says what type of action it is, and also other information to represent things that have been done in that in that action. So an action is an object, and it represents some thing that has been done within the application. 99% of the time, you're looking at a user clicked on something, a user hovered over something. It represents the user interacting with the application in some way. The other thing that usually happens is that it'll be a response from like a data fetch call, which was almost certainly initiated by the user doing something in the first place anyway. So a state is an object which represents all the things a application knows about itself. And an action is another object which represents information that a user did something with the application with. So we're going to export. Write this reducer function. Conventionally, what happens is that the action will look something like this. So an action will be like type click _ button. And there might be some payload involved. There might actually not be. The payload might be like, the ID of the button would be like, first button or something like that. So the state can be whatever we want it to be. So we're going to look at the type. We're going to say switch on action.type. We're going to say every action that we pass into this is going to have a type key, which is going to be a string, say case, click, button. And what we're going to do is return a modified copy of the state. The common way to do this is to destructure the original state with the 3 ellipses to destructure the state into its individual keys, and then follow that up with any like actual changes to the state. So we're going to say that the state is going to be something along the lines of, say, signed in is going to be false. This is going to be a key that we're going to, so the application state right now is just going to be a single object. And we're going to say signed in starts off as false, and we're going to say signed in here is going to be equal to state.signed in, but just reversed. This is a very, very trivial example of what a reducer function looks like. In the default case, in case we don't have a action for a specific action for that like action type, we're just going to return the initial state. And this is your very, very, very standard reducer function. So this looks pretty common to somebody who's done Redux before. And let's use this with React hooks within an application. So we've got our application here, and we're going to throw in some additional control here. We're going to say, let's put, first off, let's import React from React. And we're going to also import our reducer function and our initial state. So reducer function and initial state from kickstand context reducer. So let's use our reducer. The way that this kind of works is that we will say const state and dispatch. This is in a destructured array, kind of like if you're used to React useState, it'll look like that. React.useReducer. And we'll pass into this 2 parameters. The first is going to be reducer function, and the second is going to be initial state. And the initial state is going to be essentially our function that gets called with just possibly some information that will return the initial state of the application. So this will be kind of what we do to set things. If you're used to Redux, there's usually this sort of like default parameter setup that people use, but this is not what the React hooks version wants you to use. They want you to use a specific initializer. It returns 2 things. One is the current state of the application. And if you're familiar with useState, you should understand that this is going to change as things go. The second is not just going to be like a specific setter of the state, but going to be something that a function that you can use to dispatch to the store that gets created by a React useReducer to set different values of it. So we're going to have set a variable called button text, and button text is going to be state.signed in. Going to make this into a ternary and say signed in, signed out. And then we're just going to go ahead and throw into here, our button is going to have the button text on it. So it starts as signed out. And then we can throw on click, throw in a function here. Let's actually just put this into a separate function listener so we don't do too much weird inline stuff. Let's say handle button click. It's going to be a function. And we're going to dispatch, when this happens, an object type of, what did I call that originally? I called it click button. Cool. I'm very professional. We're going to say handle button click to wire these 2 things together. This is just within a single function, so there shouldn't be anything super complicated here. What we're doing is this would be very similar to if we had, say, const signed in set signed in, and we said react.useState instead, and we started it with false. And this would be essentially just be, instead of dispatch, we would just be using, set signed in equals signed in. So this should be pretty straightforward, but we're using the React pattern for this, which means that the reducer pattern for this, which means it's a lot more straightforward to add in additional functions. So this is the only call we need to make, and then to set the state, and then we can add in additional properties, add in additional actions, and things just work, which is great. So we can hit save on this, and we can see if you click this button, the state changes, which means the button text changes, and signed in, signed out, signed in, signed out. This is great. This is a very trivial example of using the reducer function to create a more structured state within a component. There's nothing like unique about this function. This is just a pure function. So is the initial state. This is just a pure function. And then what useReducer is doing is sort of taking this function and the initializer and creating an internal representation of that. So if you have multiple instances of this kind of app component, what you're going to end up doing is having a essentially having, like, you know, they're separate, they're idempotent, like having individual different stores. So this is what I would prefer to use. And honestly, it's gotten to the point where if I'm building a very simple component with information that only it needs to know about itself, I'm actually going to use useReducer, even though there's a little bit more setup involved, about 90% of the time, just because it's just so much more usable. It's so much more extendable. And it does also have the side benefit of getting around some of the weird kind of like stale reference problems that you might find in some useEffect things. If you've never encountered this before, when you essentially create, like, you know, a reference to, like, you know, a state variable inside of useEffect, because of how the closure gets set up, it can basically not have the current value. It can sometimes lose reference to the current value of a primitive variable that has been set in state. But if you use dispatch and state, you will always have the current reference available, which is great. Okay, so this is just a component that knows something about itself. We want to use this for a more straightforward thing. So if you were using Redux here, I'm picking at Redux because I know it better than I do MobX, you would probably do something like import create store from React Redux, and probably also provider as well. And we'd probably import like a reducer function, which would work exactly the same way from some like reducer code that we wrote somewhere else. And we'd say const store equals create store, pass in the reducer function, and then we would probably put a provider component. Again, this is not like this is what Redux would do. We would create a higher order component that wraps around here, and that would like kind of look like this. But since we don't have Redux in this component in this application, that's not going to work. But this is kind of what happens. In order to create a global store using the kind of reducer function setup, what we need to do is this two-step dance of creating the store globally and then also having a higher order component that wraps literally everything in our application. But then we have kind of an issue where React components won't know to re-render unless literally everything, unless the store gets passed down to literally every component inside of it, or the various values get passed down to everything inside of it. And in a relatively complicated React application, what you're gonna have is a setup where people are going to be, like a large number of people can be working on an application. And if you want some small aspect of the global state to be passed to some leaf component that's 20 levels deep, you're going to either need some way for that component to be listening to changes that happen from the global store, or you're going to need to pass that prop that component cares about all the way down the chain, from like the global store all the way down to what cares about it. Oh, I'll just increase the font size. Just saw that. Okay, so let's avoid that if we possibly can. That pattern's called prop drilling. And then if we wanted to do something with Redux, we have to do like a connected thing where we specifically set like mapping the state and the dispatch to props, which is always kind of annoying. We can do something a lot better if we use a second React hook to sort of create that global store. So that's where something called useContext comes into play. So there's a reason I call this the context folder. I'm going to create another one called index.js. And what we're going to do is set up something called a context. This is not part of React. Well, it started out not part of React hooks. It came out, I think, 16.4. It's a relatively recent invention. It predates hooks, but only by a little bit. And essentially, it's a second way within React to pass props from an ancestor component to a grandchild component somewhere further down the tree without having to pass props through each of the successive steps of ancestor components to get there. So if you're familiar with the concept of passing components, of passing props from component to component, this essentially is a sort of a warp pipe to get from one place to another. It's a second way to pass information, either individual props or callback props, from some component to another component. The structure for using it initially was a little bit awkward, especially on the consumer side, because you essentially had to return a function that got called with something and wrap everything in these weird higher order components. So let's use a better format for that. Thankfully, useContext is part of the React hook standard that came out in 16.8 along with everything else. And it's relatively easy to use as long as you set it up with some sensible defaults, which is what we're going to do. So if you want, you can read the blog post I wrote about this a few weeks ago. It's on the this.labs website, where we're more or less doing this presentation, although I'm explaining things a little bit more, and we'll be doing some extension. But what's notable is that it's got this very common pattern for creating a context and a provider. And those are two things that we need to export. And this is great because we don't really care about any of the things in this code. So I can honestly just copy this whole thing and just change the variable names here and here to better match what it is I'm building. And then we can just kind of work with that from there. This pattern will work for literally every single context. It is very generic. And so this means that we can just sort of extend it really quickly. I'm explaining what all the lines are as I'm doing it, just so that you kind of have a better idea. But note that, well, this is the most complicated part of what I'm building. And you can just copy this pattern and not have to think about it for literally all of your contexts. First thing I'm going to do is import React, because this is a React project, and I still don't feel safe not importing React in most of my files. I know it's kind of like a little bit not necessary anymore. I'm going to import our reducer function and our initial state as if we were doing this within our application. From kickstand reducer in the same directory. And then we're going to export two things. First thing is going to be our context. We're going to actually solve something here. We're going to say this is going to be our button context. And we're going to move both these files in here. So this is our button context. And we're going to say react.create context. This is not a hook. Again, this is just a file. This is a API that predates hooks. The two things we're going to pass into here are going to be the initial state and a dispatch. Dispatch is going to be something that is going to be represent the function that gets called. When you're creating a context, it's common to pass in a object that will represent whatever is in that context. A context is essentially another object that you can pass back and forth. It's common to pass in the default values of it because it helps with optimization. you don't really need to worry about this too much, but this is essentially like the just simple default values for what we're building here. We actually aren't really going to use this that much. We are going to use user provider here. Oh, sorry, not user provider, button provider. So what this is doing is creating a higher order component that we're going to pass into, we're going to wrap our entire application with. So this is kind of like in index.js. If we were using Redux, we would import this provider component and we would wrap our entire application around it. We're not going to do that here. Instead, we're just going to add in our comma. Instead, what we're going to do is this is going to be a component, so it's a higher order component, so we're going to pass children into it, and it's going to be a function, and we're going to do two things. The first is we're going to import or migrate our state and dispatch call here from react.useReducer, where it's going to work the same way. Here's our reducer function. Here's our initial state. And the second is we're going to return something. Here we're going to say, okay, we've created this context called button context up here, and we're exporting it because we need to use this other places. So what button context, so all these created contexts have by default from the original sort of API for this is it creates two components, that thing dot provider dot consumer and that thing dot provider. Provider is the one we care about because this is sort of like the higher up one. This is going to be a component that we create that goes around our entire application. So this is the higher order version. This is where the props come from. And inside of this is children, and this is pretty straightforward. If you've ever written a higher order component before, we take in some children, we wrap everything, we return the children, and we wrap everything with what we really care about. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to pass in a prop called value. And for value, this is what gets provided to a further down call to useContext. Now, what we care about with all of these like kind of useState, useReducer, whatevers, is this destructured array of like, here's the information, here's how we modify the information. Since that's the pattern we want to use, let's just use that. I'm going to pass in state and dispatch. And so it's going to be our destructured array. We're just going to restructure it. Why not? So I'll hit save on that. And unfortunately, Prettier is going to make that into a single line for me. But that's basically what we have is this higher order component where we're passing in this prop called value, which is our restructured array from react.useReducer. And this is now a component that we can use somewhere else. So let's actually do that. In our index.js file, we're going to import our button provider from useReducer's button provider. So this is our button, no, kickstand, oh, that's the wrong file. Kickstand contexts, button context, there we go. So we're exporting our context and a provider. The provider basically only ever gets used here. And we're going to just wrap the entire component with it. That's it. And then this application isn't compiling because we haven't updated the app.js yet. We can get rid of this. And we don't have a user function. So we're going to just go ahead and, well, just won't work for a second too. All right, so this was by far the most complicated part. And the important part that I want to stress to literally everyone is that it really, really does not need to change between contexts that you write. This is a generic pattern. The only thing you're going to probably want to change is the names of the variables. And then you can just kind of genericize it from there. So let's hook everything up together with one last step. There's a second hook that we probably haven't used before called useContext. So we've got our higher order thing here. our button provider is hooked up to a reducer state, and we can just use that here. So what we'll do is instead of useReducer, we're just going to do useContext. And useContext, we're going to pass into it the other thing we're exporting from that file, because we have to pass into it the entire context. That is how the API works. We're going to say import button context from kickstand context, button context. We're going to use button context here. And then we have access to state and dispatch. We could pass in whatever variable we want to and this value here. This is what will get returned, like this value here is what will get returned here. It's just that because we're using this reducer pattern and we have this destructured array pattern already, we may as well just roll with it. So useContext is returning our restructured array that we're destructuring again. There's probably an optimization there, but whatever. There's only so much time. Hit save, and hey, look, our application works again. And what's important is that when we click on this button, we're actually dispatching something. So when we dispatch this function, it goes into the global state, and it basically just fires this whole thing. This useReducer is updating the state here, which is getting passed into the provider. The provider is then making that available to any component that has a dispatch, has like that useContext attached to it. The state is updating, which means that the render function for this is refiring and updating the text. And it works just like useState, although this is globally accessible because it's wrapping the entire component here. That means that we can go ahead and do some more cool stuff. So for instance, let's add in another component that listens to this. So instead of us using this here, let's go ahead and create a second component. So we're going to say login button.js, and we're going to just import our logic here. So always import React from React. Again, probably don't need to. I'm just nervous. Export const login button equals this. And we're going to return a button with our button text. We're just going to migrate all this logic into a separate component. Const state dispatch equals react.useContext, importing our button context, which we have Visual Studio Code import because it's cool. And then our button text is here, and our handle button click is here. We're going to say on click, handle button click. And then this is cool because we'll do need to export default this. Now we can just get rid of here, like this button context, and we can probably get rid of this and this. And now all we're doing is we're importing our login button component, and we don't need to import the context here. We only need to import like the context and use the context in components that actually care about it. So we have set up a context to sort of jump over a component that we don't really care about. Another thing we can do is start adding in more properties to the initial state and more actions that allow us to modify the initial state. So in this case, let's add in our Scoobier safety tips. So we've got our reducer function, and we've got our initial state. Now let's say tips. Tips is an array, and our array is going to be strings. So tips, always be careful when riding in traffic. Don't pull your phone out while scootering. Go perpendicular over speed bumps. Other tips I would add is don't stand up and try to feel if your ribs are broken, because they probably are, and it will hurt like the dickens. And definitely also when you think you have broken ribs, go to the ER. I've had a really crappy couple of weeks. And also laughing hurts. Anyway, so let's add in this into the state. So we can also abstract this out into a separate component if we want to, or let's just not. We can, yeah, let's put this in a separate component. So let's say add in a new file here, tips list.js, and import React from React. We need to do that because we're using useContext here. And also import our button context. We only ever need to import the provider once at the higher level, but here we can do this with, but we will need to import the context everywhere we're going to use it. And you can have multiple contexts in an application if you want to have multiple globally accessible states or states that are only partially globally accessible. This is, you just would use a separate like react.useContext call for that. We're going to have a component called tips list, which takes in no parameters, but we get all of our information from state dispatch equals react.useContext, passing in that button context again. Great. And then we're going to return a ordered list for once. Usually don't use ordered lists, but just novelty. And we'll say that just like anything else, state.tips.map. We're going to iterate over this list, passing in the individual tip and the index as for the key. Hopefully you're familiar with iterating over an array in this thing. We're going to pass in a key, which is going to be the IDX, and we're going to pass in a tip. And then we're going to return export defaults, this tips list. What's notable is that we have this dispatch here. We don't actually need it here right now. So we could just use the state instead because there's right now no listeners to any actions. We're just getting information and presenting it to the users. Hit save, import this component. And nuke this, replace with this. Hit save. Hey, look, our component works again. We can go ahead and add in, don't try to do parkour and stick the landing. And it should, did it not? Oh dear. Oh, right, I have to do return. Ha, yeah, look at that. All right, hit refresh. Oh, goodness. Read property map of undefined. Let's see why that is the case. What is the state? Why did I screw this up? Oh, because this should not be a function. That's why. Well, in any case, the joys of live coding. So essentially, there is a why is this working? Oh, I know why. Because the reducer function, this needs to just be executed. Oh, goodness. Well, in any case, this should ostensibly be working. Apologies for the live coding issues. Can't read properly. This is passing the state down. We have seen this working with this button here. So while I try to figure out what the issue is, I think now is probably a pretty good time for any Q&A while I'm sort of slowly figuring out what's going wrong. So useState and useReducer should be pretty independent of each other. That's a good question, but essentially it's like if you have useState in like a few different calls to useState, this has like, you know, useState for one thing, useState for another thing. They're all independent of each other. This is a hook, so you want to make sure that anything that starts with use is at the very top of your component and always gets executed in the same order so that the memory cells kind of stay allocated to each other. And that you end up like, you know, making sure there's no if statements or anything like that. So it's always in the same order. useReducer works basically the same way though. So that shouldn't affect each other. And matter of fact, I have components where it's just like, I just need a one toggle for this thing. I'm gonna use useState, but I'll have useReducer for some more complicated logic. It's just the same order for every single like component. So all of the use hooks are basically just, okay, the first one, the value is this, the second one, the value is this, the third one, the value is this. React just behind the scenes has settings for like what's in each order for all of the use things. So there's not really like any issues there. So the fun fact about this is that it does kind of rely on a global store, as do components, but you can very easily spoof this context. And this is actually what's happening in this index.js file. So we're passing in a value here, and this is the default value for this context. And then as long as you make this context accessible, via jest mocking, you can set whatever value you want here. So if you want to have a test that's basically like, oh, well, this weird sort of state that a component gets into after 6 or 7 clicks, I want to be able to see the value there. Like you can set the value that comes here for button context. You can set that equal to whatever you want, the state here, using jest mocking, and then the component, like the state will start out in that pattern and you can make that testable. So it does have a certain dependency on having that context there, but it does allow you to mock it really easily. So this is not really a, like props and context are not really separate from each other. There is definitely a lot of utility to functional components that just get passed some information by a parent or a grandparent or something like that. Those are still very testable, very usable, lots of use cases for that. What this is great for is when you've got that kind of like globally accessible like store that you have like a weird leaf component that needs like a piece of information that its previous 19 ancestors don't. This is great for those kind of situations. So it will probably end up being a situation where you still have a lot of components that don't require any knowledge of context or the provider and get tested the same way. And just those individual components just can be fine for passing those things in. Cool. Well, I unfortunately have run into a bit of an issue here and don't entirely know what the situation is. And it's almost certainly just me being a bit unfortunate about how this is all working together with the initial state. So unfortunately, that would be the end. This will be the end of the session. But thanks everyone for coming by and listening. And if you want a text version of this, there's a blog post on the this.labs blog that will give you much more explanation and also doesn't have weird syntax errors.
Kyle, thank you so much. That was a wonderful session. Again, if you want to get a hold of Kyle, reach to him at Twitter at Kyle Hill. And this session will also be available soon. So check out our free resources on labs.this.co. I'm also going to drop our blog URL in the chat so you can check that out. And again, thank you everyone for attending. We are back at 9:30 Pacific time, 12:30 Eastern time with another Kyle, our second Kyle of the day. He's going to be talking about 11T. So come back soon. We'll see you soon. Bye.